Well, a warm welcome to you all to this evening's book launch of Dr. Lubaaba Al-Azami's new text, Travelers in the Golden Realm. Which came out the end of last year, in July of last year. But absolutely perfect timing given the V&A exhibition on the Great Moguls, which I know most people in this room will have seen, and a number of other talks that actually we've had here in this room this year, and so I think there is a certain zeitgeist within the field, which is causing us to re-examine Mughal history through different lenses in productive ways. Dr. Al-Azami has come to us from the University of Manchester, where she is a lecturer on, curiously enough, European literature, particularly with respect to the theater during the Renaissance period. And she has a number of really interesting projects that are in the works that, which deal with representations of Indian queens in Renaissance drama, and she is involved in a number of organizations, some of which are of her own founding, which deal with literatures of the early modern period, but in a global context. I think today's talk and the nature of this book, if I understand it correctly, is going to turn one of the truisms about the relationship between the East India Company and the Mughal Empire on its head, because this will be it's examining one of the early periods, or the first periods of globalization, and the assumption has been that the driving force behind it has always been the East India Company and their networks and their ambitions to accumulate capital. And without denying that, I think she will bring in other actors into the story who are often neglected. So I would like to welcome Dr. Al-Azami to present her book.
Thank you very much. Great that you, thank you very much to the Royal Asiatic Society for having me at our internet. It's great that you mentioned the Mughal exhibition, because the book is actually on sale at the Mughal exhibition in the shop of the exhibition. So so we don't have it here today, but if you want to buy it, you can go there and go to the exhibition and then buy it on the way out. Also, the picture on the cover of the book, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute, is the original is in the exhibition, and I almost screamed like a little girl when I found it. So this image is owned by the Royal Collection, so it's not something that's regularly on display. So if you want to see the original, it's beautiful, it's that big. Do go have a look. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this book. I'm just going to give an overview about the book, what it's about, what kind of themes it covers. And then I hope at the end we can have a little bit of a chat. You can ask me any questions and I can discuss. As mentioned, this looks at an earlier history of England's travels to India, the first English travelers to India. And I'm primarily a cultural historian of England. I specialize in Shakespeare and Renaissance theatre, but particularly Shakespeare and Renaissance theatre's representation of Islamic figures, and particularly Mughal Indian figures. So that's sort of the angle that I'm coming from. So I hope you find it interesting, because what it does do, what I have tried to do in this book, is revise our narrative of England's relationship with India, which is very, very heavily mediated by discourses around empire, whereas there's a lot more to this history, I think. When we start off with this book is dedicated to Gaza. It was completed when the genocide was just kicking off, and therefore it is dedicated to the conflict and to all those who have died as a result of it. One of the things, I'm an academic, and one of the things that concerns me most is the edicide. Every single university has been obliterated in Gaza. And as a historian of colonial history, contemporary colonization is also quite important to think about. So this is where I'm coming from as a historian writing this book. As I say, I'm a lecturer in Shakespeare and early modern literature. It might seem a bit strange because this is a book about India, but I specialize in English travel to India, English representations of India. That's where I'm coming from. I'm also founding editor of a digital platform called Medieval and Early Modern Orients, which is sort of a platform in which sort of provides scholarship on England's pre-modern interactions with the Islamic world. So that includes Mughal India. The overview page is sort of where I began the earliest seeds of what would become this book. And we've also got pages on Safavid Empire, Ottoman Empire, the Mediterranean. I specialize in what we call the global Renaissance. So the Renaissance is a global reality. This was a period of, or sort of the birth of globalization, really, and European interaction with the wider world on that scale for the first time. And my PhD in particular looked at English travelers to India and their interactions with Indian queens and how that emerged in theatre. So the first, maybe third of this book is kind of founded in the research from my PhD, and thereafter I sort of extended it. I finished my PhD at 1635. The book goes on until about 1707. So Britain and India, the story we're often told is a story about empires. Whenever we think of Britain's historic relationship with India, also Royal Asiatic Studies, quite tied to this particular scholarship, it's the story of Britain as a colonial entity, as a colonial power over India and Indian subjects. Now, Britain's empire, we know, is about 190 years. 1757 began in Bengal and lasted until 1947. Within living memory, my grandparents saw it happen. My grandmother's wedding, my maternal grandmother's wedding was on the day of partition. So much of popular understanding is centered on this particular period of England's history. So what I want you to think about as we go into what my book covers is, does the history start and end with Britain's empire? Because for me, for a long time, it certainly did. That was how I understood England's relationship with India, was that it was about colonialism in the past, and the present is this post-colonial period. Also, did Britain simply arrive and immediately colonize India? Was that the dynamic, that the East India Company showed up one day to these brutish people and decided, right, we're going to civilize them, colonize them, we're going to take over, we are now the people in power? Did it just happen like that, like quite swiftly and overnight? You're probably anticipating my answer. Oops. Right. No, it didn't. So as I say, you know, the history that we understand most and tend to talk about most is that 190-year history of empire. But the period prior to that, when the first English people arrived in England, was 178 years, around the same amount of time, right? But somehow we've not spoken so much about that. We've not engaged with that history as much. So Britain's relationship with India before empire is just as long and just as significant. And so that's what this book focused on, Travellers in the Golden Realm. It covers this history for the first time for a general audience. And there's a number of things that the book kind of uncovers in relation to this early period, this near 2 centuries that precedes empire, which really flips everything that happened during empire on its head. It's a completely different dynamic we experience within this time. Most significantly that I pick up on is the inverted balance of power in this period. So the Renaissance period was a world in which global power and global capital was not centered in Western Europe. It was actually centered in Asia and Africa. And so the global sort of imperial powers, the global economic powers, the military powers, were really not in Western Europe, but more in Asia and Africa. So you had the Mughal Empire, you had Ming China, you had the Ottoman Empire, that's the Safavid Persia, you had the Kingdom of Morocco. So it's a very, very different geopolitical dynamic in which England is functioning. And so the English arrivals to India were dealing with one of the superpowers of its time. England was, in modern parlance, a developing nation, so to speak. And so the English arrivals coming to Mughal India were coming to a quote-unquote developed nation. Also, it wasn't just that this was a period in which Asia and Africa sort of harbored the largest sort of polities of the period and the wealthiest empires of the period, but also that England was in a pretty bad place at this point. We were just emerging from the Reformation. We've been excommunicated twice, right? And this is our first Brexit, right? So first Henry VIII is excommunicated because he was desperate to father this son and just work through a whole line of women to do that. And, you have to, obviously what you do when you want to marry a mistress, you change the religion of your entire country, right? So that's what he did. And so he gets excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Now, on an individual level, that throws you out of the church. On a monarchical level, that means England is of the Catholic Church. England is thrown out of Catholic Europe, which happens to be majority of Europe. The Low Countries like us, but no one else. So in that sense, England was very heavily isolated at this point. And then, of course, Henry VIII, he marries Anne Boleyn, and they have Elizabeth I, who goes on to be this famed Protestant queen. And she is excommunicated by the Pope as well. So you've got this sort of double whammy of a Brexit in England. So England is hugely isolated. It's very in debt. It's really struggling. And we are an island nation. We need these partnerships. So much like Brexit today, although that was self-inflicted, much like Brexit today, when we've lost that kind of, when we've lost that connection with Europe on that level, England started seeking partners elsewhere. And the first place that Queen Elizabeth turned to was, in fact, the Ottoman Empire. And so she sent successions of ambassadors, and she developed an epistolary relationship with the king and queen. And so she developed this really rich relationship. And that was her first foray into the Islamic world. Around 1600, she grants the East India Company Royal Charter. So that's when the East India Company comes into being. So Britain was in this really difficult position and was actively reaching out to the wider world, including to Mughal India. Now, the Mughal Empire, by contrast, was in its golden age. It just happened to be the case that when we're post-Reformation and we're just emerging from this difficult situation and we're trying to find our feet again, Mughal India is thriving. So you can imagine the first English arrivals to come to Mughal India, these guys did not walk in and colonize this land. It wasn't going to happen because the political dynamics were so very, very different. So that's another thing that this book kind of taps into, is just the sheer difference in terms of geopolitical authority between these two nations and how that emerged how that dynamic emerges in the encounter. So the terms of encounter then were not empire and wouldn't be empire for at least 178 years. The terms of this first stretch, equivalent time to Britain's empire, did not have empire in it at all. The English people who first arrived, they were influenced by a number of reasons. One was primarily trade. That was the first reason. And the reason for that was the Indian Ocean, but particularly Indonesia and then India, and this is something that I go into the book as well, was the home of the most lucrative commodity of this time, which was spice, literally cloves, mace, cardamom, these kind of commodities. So Western Europe was desperately trying to seek direct trade routes to this part of the world to sort of go around the Arab intermediaries who were putting the prices up through the Silk Route before they reached Venice and reached the rest of Europe. So Portugal first got there, and thereafter England followed about a century later. We were tended to be a bit slow about things. So the first impetus was trade. Other things that sort of fed this desire to travel was diplomacy. So we sent successions of successive English ambassadors to India. Mughal India never sent a single one to us, but we sent about 3 within the time period that I'm covering. And then there was also piracy, right? So the East India Company was sort of the main presence, but as soon as people realized that the Indian Ocean is this rich, and now we have a direct maritime route to it thanks to the Portuguese, the pirates started coming, the Jack Sparrows of the world. And quite literally, they came from the Atlantic and the Caribbean. So that was another term of encounter. And much, much later, over a century later, you had military conflict. There was one war that took place, called war, I think it's a bit of a tenacious term to call it, but one military conflict that the English East India Company had with the Mughals that ended as expected. So another aspect that my book covers is that the subtitle is How Mughal India Connected England to the World. Now, this period is really England's moment of global birth. And part of that was propelled by the fact that we were so isolated. We needed these new global connections to survive. But also, particularly, the trade in Mughal India was incredibly difficult. First of all, we didn't get to India directly, and that's one of the things that my book argues, that India was sort of an afterthought. We really wanted to go to Indonesia. Now, when we went to Indonesia, our primary commodity from England was something called broadcloth. It's made from wool, woven in Cornwall. Thank you, Welsh people, for giving us sheep. And so it was this thick, coarse wool, which was very popular in Northern Europe because it's cold up there. So in Northern Europe, this stuff sold very well. Now, you can imagine in the Renaissance world, where it's not so easy to travel, people are traveling all the way to India for the first time. They've never been there. They don't know what the climate's like. They don't know what these countries are like. So they're going all the way to India, carrying these massive bolts of woolen broadcloth. And then they show up to this monsoon land where everyone's in like muslin and no one's interested in stuff. Right? So they went to Indonesia with broadcloth and the Indonesians said, no, thank you. We're not going to sell our spice to you for that stuff. So then the East India Company thought, okay, you know what? We need to figure out how we're going to do this. So then they noticed that local traders, particularly Gujarati traders from India, were buying spices in Indonesia using cotton from India. And this had a roaring trade. This was selling beautifully in Indonesia. They loved the stuff. So then the English traders realized, okay, what we really need to be doing is going back to India and getting this cotton because that's what seems to sell here. And that's how we rebounded into India. India was not even the direct target of the East India Company and its foundation. India in this period was quite a capacious term. It pretty much meant anything east of South Africa. So the Indian Ocean region, pretty much India. So that's how we ended up in India. But that's just that's perhaps the first example of kind of the internationalist strategy that the East India Company had to adopt in order to survive in India. And that's the sort of other story that this book hopes to bring, that how Mughal India connected England to the world is that trade in Mughal India required an internationalist strategy. And that's something that is really somewhat admirable about the East India Company because they spent the entirety of this 178 years struggling, but they stuck at it. And they realized that we have to figure out how to make this work because this country is too lucrative to let go. So this book, although it's about England and Mughal India, it also covers Persia, covers Indonesia, covers East and West Africa, covers the Middle East, and covers the Americas. So for example, Indonesia was one example of, went to Indonesia, rebounded off to India to get cotton and realized actually India's got quite a lot of stuff, let's stay here. So then we stayed on here, but the trade within India had the same problem. No one wants broadcloth. In one East India Company letter, the trader said, and I quote, "It is so unvendable. It would be better not to send it for another year or two." Like they really just could not sell the stuff. It would just stay in their factories, just rotting. So then they thought, okay, let's study the markets here. Let's see what sells here. They went to the Indian markets. One thing they noticed was these people love ivory. Not just these people, the women love ivory. So then the East India Company decided that what we need to do is we need to get our hands on ivory. Where do we get that? East and West Africa. So that took the Indian trade onto East and West Africa. They realized that another thing that seems to sell in India are Persian horses. They went off to Persia. They realized that, they realized that, okay, we're not being able to purchase with our goods. We're having to get these commodities, but the most common currency here is in silver. They got silver from South America and Japan. So that kind of internationalist strategy is what helped the East India Company survive in this really difficult early period. So some of the first arrivals that I cover in this book, because this book it essentially covers the very, very first arrivals and travelers. So it starts with the stories of individuals because that's who first traveled to India. It was individual people. And then later that history bloomed and thickened, and you had sort of fleets of East India Company people going, you had tourists going, you had all sorts of people going. But in the very early stages, it was individuals, and these were really, really interesting individuals. So they included Thomas Stevens, the first English person to travel to India. And not the first English person to travel to India necessarily. There is a bishop in medieval England who we believe went there, but it's difficult to trace it. But Thomas Stevens was the first person to actually voyage there by sea. So he went there in 1579, and he was a religious refugee. He was someone fleeing the Catholic persecution of Elizabeth I. So the first Englishman in India was a refugee. Thereafter, you had merchants. So there's, of course, the East India Company. So there's very many merchants who feature in this book. But perhaps, one of my favorites is William Hawkins. This guy went to India and tried to become Indian, which is a feature of this book. So he went to India. He sort of became friendly with the emperor, Emperor Jahangir. Emperor Jahangir found him very interesting because he found this Northern European man showing up spouting Turkish, because William Hawkins had spent time in the Ottoman Empire. And that was sort of the trajectory of many of these East India Company travelers, that they'd first serve in the Ottoman Empire, and then they'd go on to join the East India Company. And of course, the English trading community was very interconnected. So East India Company traders were involved in the Atlantic slave trade as well. So William Hawkins, he was the one who captained the first East India Company fleet to reach India. And he went on to ingratiate himself to the Mughal emperor. He started wearing Indian clothes. He started sitting on the floor and eating with his hands. They set up an Indian household for him. They gave him the title of Khan. Jahangir really had fun with this guy. He thought, you know what, I'm going to dress him up. And so he did. He dressed him up as an Indian. And then, so he gave him clothes, he gave him a name, he gave him a household, and William Hawkins was fully in on it. And then he said, how about an Indian wife? And William Hawkins said, if you find me a Christian one, sure. And of course, Mughal India then as now was a hugely diverse land. So the emperor had one of his wards in his royal household was a young lady called Mariam Khan, who was Christian. So William Hawkins and Mariam Khan married, and then they traveled back to London. Mariam Khan became the first Indian noblewoman to reach England, 1613. And then we have diplomats. So Thomas Roe, he's the first English ambassador to India. There's a mural of him in Parliament. So he went in 1615, stayed for 4 years, didn't succeed in getting what he wanted, but got sick a lot of the time because he insisted on wearing taffeta in the monsoon weather, because you have to represent your king and you have to look the part. So he spent a lot of that time sick, poor thing, and he kept writing back to England saying, please let me come home. And they said, no, do your job. So he had to stay there for 4 years, and then he came back. And then is my personal favorite, Thomas Coriat. Now, to travel to India was not easy. You might set off around February, March. By the time you reach, you're pushing September, October. You're voyaging around the entirety of the African continent and across the entirety of the Indian Ocean. So if the dysentery or the scurvy doesn't get you, the storm or the piracy might. Any number of things could kill you on the way. So it takes a really strong impetus to undergo that kind of toil to reach India. And of course, the primary impetus was the great wealth of this land, how rich you can become if you manage to get there. And so the primary reason people went to India was for trade. Thomas Coriat went as a tourist, and his primary aim was to ride on an elephant. And so he did it walking as well. He was particularly interesting. So he actually first wet his feet in Europe. He did a walking tour of Europe. He's credited with introducing the fork and the umbrella to England from Italy. And then he wrote this book called Coriat's Crudities, and it was a bestseller. And Thomas Coriat really liked fame. He liked people to talk about him. So then he thought, that went well, let's go to India next. And so then he walked all the way to India, and he spent several years there. He went around the same time that Thomas Roe was there. They had a fascinating time together. He basically went and hitched up with the ambassador and stayed with him without, whether he was welcome or not is a different discussion, but he decided, I'm going to stay, and he just hitched up with them for months on end and basically ate all their food. So Thomas Coriat is a character who I'm particularly fond of. He's from Odcombe in Somerset, so they called him Odd Tom, quite predictably. So that's Thomas Roe, who's the ambassador, and over there you've got Thomas Coriat. So some of the Mughal figures that the book covers. As I say, this book sort of covers the Mughal Golden Age period. So it covers from Babur, who's the founder of 1526, to Alamgir, who reigned until 1707. Alamgir is the guy with the bird over there. But it also covers various Indian queens and princesses. And this is something that I wanted to really incorporate within this book, is to give the various voices of history a hearing. So in this volume, I'm dealing with East India Company sources. I'm also dealing with Mughal memoirs, and I'm also looking at the place that women played within the history. And the Mughal Empire in particular, the queens and princesses were hugely, hugely influential. So for example, in Jahangir's reign, which is the reign during which the first East India Company fleet reached India, the Thomas Roe was sent as an ambassador. It was during his reign. He was, his chief consort, Nur Jahan Begum, was his co-sovereign. So they ruled pretty much together. Nur Jahan Begum had unprecedented authority in the empire. So one of the things that she did that only the emperor gets to do is she minted coins in her name. She used to issue legal decrees as well. So she's one person who I look at, and you can see her, she's right at the end filling a musket over there because she was an incredible shot. She used to sit inside her canopy on top of an elephant, and she could shoot a target dead on. So she was especially skilled. Another queen I explored, and Nur Jahan Begum, she was the person who Sir Thomas Roe, the ambassador, really had to appeal to in order to get the English trading agreement that he never actually managed to get. Then there's Mariam Al-Zamani, who was the queen mother of Jahangir, the mother of the emperor, and she was Mughal India's leading shipping magnate of anyone. Her ships were the largest in the Indian Ocean, could be recognized from miles away. And one of the things that the Portuguese used to do in the Indian Ocean was they used to enforce something called a cartaz system. It's a protection racket. So essentially, you pay us this amount and we won't attack your ship. And it was Mariam Al-Zamani's ships which used to set the going rate for the cartaz because they were that massive and significant on the ship. So inevitably, a queen who is co-sovereign and a queen who is the leading business person of this empire inevitably were involved in the East India Company's interactions in India. So I kind of explore that as well. And of course, as I mentioned in the previous slide, I also look at the spouses of East India Company traders. And the East India Company traders were, of course, all men, so the spouses were women. So you had Mariam Khan, who I've mentioned. Also, you have this fabulous person called Teresa Sampsonia, who was similar to Mariam Khan, but from Persia. So she was a ward of the Persian royal court. She married someone called Robert Shirley, who was an English merchant ambassador. And I should read her up. She's incredible. She was like a polyglot. She was an archer, a swordsman. She lived 40 years in Europe, and she was called the ambassadress. She was seen as the female ambassador to the Persian Empire, which is quite a big deal in this time for a woman to achieve that. So she was ambassadress. And that's her over there. She and her husband sat for a portrait, which was painted by Anthony van Dyck. Anthony van Dyck would go on to be the lead court painter for the Stuart court, for Charles I. And she and her husband sat for portraits. And so she's wearing Persian clothes, and her husband, Robert Shirley, fully Englishman, was also dressed up as a Persian, massive turban and silk robes. So some of the major events that this book covers, one is piracy. Piracy was a big problem, particularly towards the end of the century, because the East India Company, they were there for trade. But as I say, as soon as the sort of maritime route to the Indian Ocean and India was opened, the pirates followed. And so there were many pirates, European pirates, including English pirates, that were sort of ravaging the Indian Ocean. And the problem for the East India Company in particular was that the Mughals did not differentiate. If an English pirate attacked a Mughal vessel, the East India Company in Surat took the hit for it. Because as far as the Mughals were concerned, all English people are the same, or all Europeans are the same. So there would be times when an English vessel might attack a ship, and then all European trade would be halted. So this was a major challenge for the East India Company. So I look at two particular cases of piracy that were particularly significant. One is the piracy of the Rahimi. The Rahimi was the ship that belonged to Queen Mariam Al-Zamani, the Queen Mother. That was captured by the Portuguese in 1613. All hell broke loose because you don't mess with the Queen Mother. You don't mess with the King's mum. So all hell broke loose because of that. And the Portuguese came under such assault by the emperor that they never truly recovered. And that became an opportunity for the English to advance in India. And then in 1695, I look at another case called the piracy of the Ganji Sawai. And the Ganji Sawai was a ship owned by Aurangzeb Alamgir, the last and most influential of the emperors of the Mughal Golden Age. And so this particular vessel, it was, when it was attacked, it was all the more controversial because these vessels were all merchant vessels, but they were also pilgrim vessels. So they would travel through the Indian Ocean, stopping at various points, and then go on through the Red Sea, stop at Jeddah, and then the pilgrimage. So So the Ganges Sawai was on its way back with pilgrims, and the pirates who attacked it, Henry Every, when they attacked it, they sort of inflicted a rapacious orgy on these pilgrims, one of whom was the emperor's relative. So that became a huge scandal that almost destroyed the East India Company enterprise. Again, if an English pirate does something, the East India Company will account, even if they have nothing to do with this guy. And what it really triggered was a huge global manhunt for Henry Every. He was never found, but it triggered a huge global manhunt, which the East India Company, they appealed to the monarch back in England, who then agreed and set off this sort of global manhunt to warrant Henry Every's head. But he was never caught, and they did this because it was threatening to collapse their entire Indian enterprise, because that's how angry the emperor was. So one of the chapters in the volume, which for me is perhaps the most important and difficult one, is chapter 12. I call it Trade and Souls. Now, when I sort of set out to write this book, I thought, you know what, there's a lot of trade happening in this period. This is the period in which you have sort of the rise and advance of the Atlantic slave trade, the Royal African Company. There must be overlap. Trading companies are always interacting. So I set out to try to find these connections between the East India Company and the Royal African Company and the Atlantic slave trade. What I didn't anticipate was to find an entire ecosystem of European-led slave trading in the Indian Ocean. And so that's what Trade and Souls covers. It covers the really expansive network of trade in enslaved peoples that was taking place in the Indian Ocean. So to give you an idea of just how huge this is, the Dutch traded in twice as many people in the Indian Ocean as it did in the Atlantic slave trade. So something like 2 million people in the Indian Ocean. So this is a slave trade that we know that we talk less about, and I feel that we need to be talking about it a lot more. It functioned in parallel and interconnected with the Atlantic slave trade. So really, slave trading was a global reality. The Atlantic slave trade is one section of a global sort of economy that was taking place at the time. And so the East India Company was very much involved in this. I mean, the East India Company was trading in people, was acquiring enslaved people to man their various posts in the Indian Ocean. So this was quite a shocking discovery for me, and quite a difficult chapter to write, because it was also a matter of trying to do justice to a very human, brutal history. So this is a chapter that I always try to highlight whenever I'm talking about. So the ultimate story of this book is that the story is a lot longer than what we've been told, and a lot more complex and a lot more interesting. So what I hope that people will take from this is that it will help to sort of set a context for the later history that we know so well, and help us to understand the threads that continue to this day. Because history of that period goes on to feed the history that came after, and goes on to feed the present. One of the things that brought me to writing this particular book is, as I say, my grandparents saw partition, and my maternal grandmother's wedding was on the day of partition. And it always strikes me that my grandparents' generation went through 4 citizenships they had no control of. They started as British Indian subjects, then they became Indian, then they became Pakistani, then they became Bangladeshi. Mm-hmm. And it was in the aftermath of them becoming Bangladeshi that my family ended up in England as refugees of a war. So these things impact us to this day. This is part of our history as Britain, part of our global history as global Britain, which started centuries ago. So I hope that this book will help to return some of this neglected history back to the story and back to the spotlight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a really interesting view of a rather neglected portion of the history of the interaction between England and India, and bringing it back into the forefront. I was wondering if in the course of your talk, you stressed how important it was to focus on this this period, to provide a new perspective on what came thereafter. And I was wondering whether at the same time you felt that there were certain differences in attitudes that people held then that were lost as one moved into the later period of colonial rule. Or do you see significant continuities in certain themes, certain perceptions? I was wondering if you could flesh out that sort of transition or not a little bit more for us.
I mean, this is why I find Renaissance transculturality so interesting. It's so different to the colonial period. This is before what Edward Said called Orientalism had really come into a crystallized form. So in my tracing of how England's interacting with the wider world, I sort of see the echoes of Orientalism emerging in the Anglo-Ottoman encounter, so the interactions with the Ottoman Empire. And I see that as being fed by a number of things. One is that the Ottoman Empire is actively conquesting across Europe, so they're seen as an active threat, and so that, you know, you need to malign an active threat in order to, you know, if you can't conquer them on the battlefield, you conquer them on the theatrical field, apparently. With Mughal India, again, it was very interesting because Mughal India is unique in the Islamic sort of empire base of this period, because it's the only empire which is a minoritized Muslim monarch governing a majority non-Muslim polity. So their approach was more secular in some ways. So, for example, the Safavids, strong Shia Muslim identity. The Ottomans, strong Sunni Muslim. The Moroccans, strong Sunni Muslim. The Mughals were very pragmatic in terms of their approach. So even the English arrivals to India didn't see this as an Islamic land. They saw this as a land of many people. And they saw this as a land where people seem to get on, like you don't have as much religious conflict, which they found quite interesting, because you're just coming from the Reformation. Catholics and Protestants aren't getting, you know, Thomas Stevens had to flee. So, you know, back in Europe, you're having real conflict of religions, but you come to India and they're seeing that it's a lot more cohesive. So if I give an example, Thomas Coriat, very strong Protestant man, this guy. So he comes to India, and that you've got a muaddin, the caller to prayer, and he's going up to his minaret and he's doing the Muslim call to prayer. And Thomas Coriat, you know, gets his back up, and he climbs up a building that's adjacent as high as he can go, and he bellows back at the muaddin that there is no God but God, and Isa is the son of God, Jesus is the son of God. And then he throws in for good measure, Muhammad's an imposter. And they basically, you know, they were like, right, crazy man, and they just moved on. They completely ignored him. And Edward Terry, who's Thomas Roe, the ambassador's chaplain, he says that, you know, thankfully over here, you know, people can practice their religion. And so they did not do anything to him. They just saw him as a madman. So that was the dynamic that the English came and understood. And so so on that level, they found it quite interesting. On the other level, they were in awe of this land. You know, they came thinking, wow, these people are powerful, these people are rich. They were obsessed with coconuts for some reason. So the approach to India was very, very different to sort of the later Orientalist narratives that we get from the colonial period of these, you know, these barbarous others. It was actually a lot more curious. It was marked by curiosity and a genuine interest to understand and learn, because they needed to thrive in this land. And they certainly didn't have the superiority complex necessary for that Orientalist attitude. You're not the colonial power, you're not the person in power, so you don't come with that idea of I am superior to you. So in that sense, I actually find, you know, the English entry in this period more wholesome than the stuff that we're used to after that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But who were the slaves for? I know what they actually doing. Very industrial. They just go home.
Okay, so if I give you the Dutch example, the Dutch loved to build forts all over the Indian Ocean. Everywhere they went, they built another fort. The Portuguese did it as well. And these forts were often built by enslaved labor. So it was often the case that enslaved people would be the ones manning these outposts, because of course you're many leagues from home. Apparently you don't want to hire local people and give them a living wage. So you get enslaved labor, and that's what the East India Company used as well. The East India Company had enslaved labor in their various outposts, and the Dutch engaged in it as well. And of course, there was an economy of there. It's not like the Europeans came and invented the slave trade. There was a slave trade prior to that, but it was a lot more fragmentary and sort of scattered and limited. The Europeans came and made it big business and sort of developed the networks of it and the structures of it, and really made it an advanced economy in this space. So, so the Dutch would actively trade in enslaved people as part of their commerce. The East India Company were involved in that to some degree, but the East India Company's primary trade was in sort of textiles and silks and spices. But they did engage in this kind of trade as well. They interacted with the Dutch on that level. The Portuguese, similar in that, they traded in enslaved peoples, but they also employed them in their various plantations. So it was, building, it was plantations, cultivation, that sort of thing. Not too dissimilar from the American model. Some of them were being brought home, yes. So the East India Company records, the ship records, do have records of people being brought and sent back to the Indian Ocean. So some of them were brought. And that's an interesting point, because what this trade was doing 400 years ago was increasingly diversifying the face of Britain. Not just by the enslaved people being brought back, but like I said, that, when English fleets were going off to India, dysentery and all these other things could kill you. By the time you've reached India, half your crew is dead. So what do? You hire local Indian sailors. And these Indian sailors would come back to England aboard these ships. So England was becoming increasingly diversified in this period. We talk about post-war migration, World War II, post-World War II or post-World War I, particularly post-World War II. But really, this was happening 400 years ago. That's when this diversity was emerging. And I look at one example of a group of sailors who managed to make it back to India, and then they take a grievance to the English ambassador saying the East India Company hasn't paid us. They owe us money. It's London. So, and then it becomes a great big thing, but that's in one of the later chapters. So, it's quite an economy going.
It's probably a question. For the English route west, that's everything. Cosmopolitan.
Sure. Surat was the main trading port on the western coast. So that's where the English were coming. And Surat was hugely diverse. You had people from all over the world coming to that port. So you had the traders from Europe coming, you had traders coming from all over the Indian Ocean, from the Arabian Sea, from the Persian Gulf, from Africa, East Africa, and also from like Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia more towards the west coast, but on more towards the east coast, sorry. And on the west coast, you had a lot of this diverse crowd coming. So that was sort of the color of Surat that the English encountered. So if I give an example of one incident that I covered was later on in the book, there's a guy in who was a real thorn in the side of Alamgir I called Shivaji, the Maratha warrior. I don't know if any of you know him. I love this guy, he's a bit of a clown. So he and there's an interesting story about Shivaji as well. But so he attacks Surat relentlessly because he's basically resisting against Alamgir's expansion in the Deccan. So he attacks Surat relentlessly. And so in the English records, you kind of get an idea of how that caused disruption within the very cosmopolitan community of Surat. So for example, English traders got abducted. Other European traders got abducted. The Europeans kind of got together to try to protect their forts with each other. But also, it gives the story of an Ethiopian ambassador who's also been abducted by Shivaji. So that just gives you a flavor of just how cosmopolitan this space was. And it was because Mughal India was a huge economy, and everyone was coming there to trade. Everyone was coming there to form diplomatic partnerships. Thomas Rowe has a section talking about a Persian ambassador he is very, very jealous of because the Persian ambassador seems to get everything he wants, and Thomas Rowe can't negotiate a crumb out of the Mughals. So, you know, you really do get a flavor for how cosmopolitan Mughal India is, and you get it from their portraits as well. If you look at this portrait, even the makeup of the people in the Mughal court are really, really quite diverse. And that was the nature of Mughal India. It was hugely, the court itself reflected the state. And while I'm talking about this picture, because I really love it. So this is the court of Shah Jahan. I should speak in the mic. So this is the court of Shah Jahan, in case the folks on Zoom don't hear it. And so I wanted an image that really captures the dynamic of the Mughal relationship with England. So the Mughal court was hierarchical. So the person nearest to the emperor was of the highest authority. And then the further out you went, the less important you were, so to speak. So you've got Shah Jahan up there. He's talking to his two princes, Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb would become Alamgir. You can see him on his Jaroka, which is the sort of balcony. Further down, those are his ministers you've got there. And then you've got these golden rungs. And if you look on the outside of it, you've got a bunch of English people over there with their trays of gifts saying, please notice us. So, and Shah Jahan isn't noticing them at all. He's talking to his princes, is completely like that. Whereas the English people, if you see, they're looking out at you, saying, do you think he's noticed us? So this really captured for me the dynamic of the English experience in this early moment. It's very, very different to the colonial experience. But also it captures the dynamic of the Mughal court in terms of its hierarchy and also its diversity and the sort of and the interactions that are happening in this space. I hope that helps.
Oh, yes, thank you. I enjoyed that very much. Really look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
It's global, particularly European context, to the visitors to the Mughal. So, because the book is about British, it's seeing that by default through the future, you know, through the British Empire. Were the British at that time, you're thinking about the most popular or privileged anyway, or were they just British diplomats, British, explorers, secular and religious? Were they just one of many in terms of especially other European? And I know there others were there, but did they have a role, or was it?
Sure. So whether English people were special in terms of the Mughal space, we weren't. We really, really weren't. If anything, we came over a century late. So the Portuguese got there in 1498. The Portuguese got there before the Mughals even got there. So Babur established the Mughal Empire in 1526. And the Portuguese had sort of by then settled themselves in Goa. So the English came a lot later, about a century later. So it was quite a challenge for the English in terms of, and I say English because Britain didn't come into formation until the 18th century, sorry, early 18th century. But so at this point, it really is just England. And then James comes and sort of tries to stick England and Scotland together and doesn't quite succeed. So the English sort of arrive, and they are new at the one end, and it's as much a challenge for them to get the Mughals' attention because the Mughals were, they had established, the English came to a mature trading environment. The Mughals had established networks with the entire region, with the Persians and Central Asia and China and Japan, everyone in this and the Middle East. So they had established contacts. So you had to really make them see why they'd want to trade with you because they didn't need to. Mughal India was also agrarian. It was funded by land taxation and it was self-funding. So the trade was really just supplementary to their needs. They were doing it because they wanted to, and they rather liked the commodities of other lands, not because they economically needed it. So the English coming into that had quite a mountain to climb in terms of making the Mughals see that it's worth trading with them. On top of that, their primary commodity was broadcloth, which no one wanted. So they had quite a hill to climb in that respect. And then on top of that, they were late European arrivals here, and the other Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, saw them as a threat. So the Portuguese were constantly machinating against them. William Hawkins, the first English East India Company captain to dock in India, reports that they tried to kill him on at least 3 occasions. So the Europeans the other Europeans who were there, particularly the Portuguese, who were very, very particular that India is our monopoly, which is why they sort of had this iron-fisted grip on the Indian Ocean, because they said, this is a maritime route we discovered, it's ours. Now, the problem is, you can discover it, but the moment it's been discovered, it has been discovered. So everyone else is going to follow. So the Portuguese were a huge challenge, and I covered that in the book. I've got a chapter specifically focusing on that. Another was the Dutch. When the Portuguese went into decline, particularly after they tried attacking the Queen Mother's ship, and that shot them in the foot. After that, it was the Dutch. The Dutch sort of arrived around the same time we did, and they were far better funded and equipped than us, because the East India Company was a joint stock company. It was kind of private investors. The Dutch were a state company. They were supported by the state. The Admiralty seconded ships for them, so they were very, very well funded, very, very well equipped, and they also hated any competition. We had 3 wars with the Dutch in that 1 century over trade. We didn't. The English had a really difficult time in India. At the one end, because the Mughals could not see a need to trade with them. At the other end, because they had intense competition from the Europeans who wanted to kill them. And the Europeans were constantly at each other's throats. And there were various sort of agreements and alliances that were formed along the way, but that broke, that reformed, that sort of thing was good. So it was a really challenging space. But if you managed to break through that, you could get very, very rich. That's why they stuck to it.
Fascinating talk, thank you very much, and very interesting to see history through the eyes of individuals. I'm very interested to know what prompted you to get into this area of research. Were there any particular documents that opened your eyes to the issues involved? Were there different languages that you were able to get information? How did you build up the story and the research?
Sure, I mean, I guess because when I was doing my MA at SOAS down the road, I did my thesis on the first English translation of the Quran, which came out in 1649. And so as part of that, I was doing research, and particularly tied to England's relationship with the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire was sort of the Islamic entity that England felt it was contending with. And so part of that research, I read quite a lot of Nabil Matar's work. He's a very well-known scholar in this subject, and it was one of his footnotes which said that we need more work on England's relationship with India in this period. And I said, I shall do it. So that was one of many reasons that, I went down this route. But one really significant reason was the fact that the moment I started going down this route, I realized that this is a history that we're not talking about, but it is no less impactful and significant, and it's a very, very different story. And it struck me that by focusing on the colonial period without its context, we're not understanding this relationship. We've got only half the story. And so I really wanted to get the rest of the story.
Maddie, do we have any questions from people attending by Zoom? No. Okay, well, let's thank Dr. Al-Azami for a fascinating talk. Thank you. That was lovely.